Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's HELM webinar hosted by the Leadership Development Group, entitled From Territoriality to Territoriality, Managing Boundaries and Obstacles in the Healthcare Ecosystem, being presented by TLD Group consultant, Dr. Larry McEvoy. We will begin momentarily. Just a few quick notes while we wait for a few more people to join the call. All attendees will have entered the webinar on mute. However, we welcome your questions and comments. While on mute, feel free to enter them into the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel on your screen. We will take time during or towards the end of the webinar to address them. Lastly, we will be recording this session. The recording and presentation will be made available to all attendees. We are now ready to begin. It is my pleasure to introduce Tracy Duberman, President and CEO for the Leadership Development Group. Tracy?
Thank you, Lisa. It's a pleasure to see so many familiar names logging into the presentation today. We are really excited to have Larry McEvoy join us, but just by way of introduction in terms of who we are, for those of you that are new to the Leadership Development Group, Larry, if you would
next slide.
Move forward on the slide, that would be great.
Uh-oh.
Okay, we're having a little bit of technical difficulties, but while Larry pulls up the PowerPoint slide, I'll tell you a little bit about TLD Group. So we are a global talent development firm that works exclusively in the health ecosystem, which we define as the payer, provider, and pharmaceutical sectors that comprise the health industry. And our mission is around developing leaders and teams to execute strategy, both within their organization and within their sector, and most importantly, across the health ecosystem. Our vision is around transforming the industry and doing so through what we believe are its greatest assets, which is its people, through our innovative talent development solutions. And for those of you that know us well, and those of you that are just joining TLD Group as a friend, we ascribe to these values that you see here on this slide as it relates to the relationships that we have with our faculty and those that we develop with our clients, those that are existing and also potential clients. So these are the values that we hold true to the work that we do and the relationships that we foster around innovation and mindfulness, passion for doing the work that we do in the industry, our flexibility in our approach, our curiosity, and also our teamwork. As many of you know, next slide, Larry, our work focuses on this ecosystem. We spent the last year or so doing research and ultimately publishing a book that focuses on this new leadership model, which we've been using to help develop leaders, both clinical and operational leaders within different sectors of the health industry. And this model is one that we've been focusing on through our HELM webinar series. For those of you that attended the first two, we focused on envisioning the future and aligning stakeholders. And today we're focusing on the third competency cluster entitled Managing Boundaries and Obstacles. Our intention for having these webinars is to showcase different types of leadership techniques to develop these particular competencies. And we're really pleased today to have Dr. Larry McEvoy, one of our most sought after faculty members and a Renaissance man, delivering this particular session for us. We met Larry many years ago, and we've been incredibly impressed, and I would say blessed to have him as part of our organization. And just recently, we're really proud that Larry has opened up his own firm called Epidemic Leadership. And his focus is working with CEOs and executive teams, trying to shift whole systems as a system, as opposed to the incremental reforms that we see many other organizations cultivating within their clients. His focus is on three different areas of change and aligning those areas, and those are performance, learning, and vitality. And he'll talk a little bit more about that throughout the presentation. In terms of his background and areas of expertise, at the base of Larry, he is an extremely prolific writer as well as orator. He's a physician, Stanford trained. He helps executives through change processes, and most importantly, his focus is on leadership, making individuals and teams and organizations capable of shifting their mindset, their culture, and their performance so that they can reach their intended outcomes. So we are incredibly pleased to have Larry with us today. And without further ado, Larry, I will turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Tracy. I appreciate it. And for some reason, my control is no longer working. If someone else has the screen, if you could give it back to me, that'd be great, as I'm hitting my toggles and it's not working.
Okay.
Let's see
if we can. Let's see if we can take control.
It could be a long 60 minutes looking at a picture of me, my force rolling their eyes somewhere after about 15 seconds of that.
Yeah, so I am going to ask Tara if you could potentially pull the presentation up on your screen, and then we will give you sharing rights.
All righty, let me just get that going. Hold on one second.
I don't know why my PowerPoint keeps going down. I apologize.
That's okay. We'll get it going. Tara, I'm going to give you organizer rights. There you go.
Okay, great. All right, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yep.
Great. Well, you just let me know and I will forward them for you.
Great. So again, apologies everyone. The first little crash you saw was the fact that my phone's connected to my laptop, and we know that obstacles and boundaries are everywhere. We found another one today. So like to thank you for coming. I know that the webinar experience is not as good as it is if we were all in the same room. I'll do my best to make sure that this is informative and hopefully entertaining as well. For those of you that are interested in the objectives here, Tracy said we really do not just metaphorically, but literally live in an ecosystem world these days. I think it's sometimes a thought that we have that we live in an ecosystem, and that is a metaphor, not a reality, but humans are biological creatures, at least those I know, and I think most of the ones you know as well, maybe a few that aren't. And when we put us all together, we really are a network of biological beings, and we follow all those rules in a way that I think is potentially very abundant, not necessarily reductive. I don't mean to reduce us to the level of, you know, mere living particles bumping into each other, but I think these days we have the chance to build things and design things that are absolutely amazing, and we have this pressure on us to do it as well in healthcare, right? I mean, we've got the same list where cost has to go down, and patient experience and clinician experience has to deepen and improve. And we're realizing more and more that we have touch points with people, whether it's in the work we do internally in healthcare, or the fact that we see patients or people that aren't even yet patients who want to stay healthy. And that's challenging us to think in different ways. So I want to thank Tracy and the folks at TLD for putting this idea of ecosystem thinking on the map via the book. If you haven't read it yet, it's a great read. It's a simple read and it's a practical read, and I'll put a plug in for it at the end as well. But today what we're going to do is talk a little bit about why it's so helpful to be able to cross boundaries and manage obstacles as we look for collaboration that can drive new value in healthcare. We're going to look at some practices and some examples. And then what I really want to challenge us to think about is that this isn't just a competency or a skill that should be held by a few people. This is really something that you want to flow and diffuse everywhere. There are literally uncountable numbers of boundaries and obstacles, and certainly we can come up with a list and think of a few that are really important that we maybe want to tackle. But I think an organization or a team's capacity to do this, capacity being defined as the amount of times you can do it again and again and again in any combination of people and any time and any topic, is really what we're after. And that there really is a method for designing that capacity, and it's a method that's grounded in biology, grounded in what we know about human neuroscience and what we know about network science. It's very learnable, and it also is a bit of a shift from maybe how we've been taught to get things moving in organizations. You can go to the next slide, Tara. And you're gonna have to, yeah. So we talked about envisioning the future. We talked about aligning stakeholders. Today, as Tracy mentioned, we're talking about boundaries and obstacles. And after that, we'll be talking about acting and learning. I mentioned this only to say that apropos of the whole idea of this webinar series, these 4 things themselves are integrated and you can't look at them separately. So if you're really envisioning a future, you've got to not only envision boundaries and obstacles, but you've got to have the inspiration for people to realize that those boundaries and obstacles are something that they want to tackle and have the capacity to do. If you're aligning stakeholders, you're really not aligning them to sort of sit there and have a party. You got real work to do. And once you have an idea about how you want to manage boundaries and obstacles that we'll talk about today, the key is not knowing or thinking about, it's actually acting and learning. So these 4 topics themselves, even though sort of PowerPoint depicted the 4 quadrants that Tracy talked about as just that, 4 quadrants, are really integral functions. And leaders will want to be thinking about how do you facilitate, action, learning, and continual attempts and iterations at these in an integral way. You can go to the next slide, please. So today, we're going to talk about this. These are everywhere in every ecosystem, which is why having a framework is so important. And I've already said that, so we'll move on. So why is it important to do this is something that we'll talk about. These skills really are essential. We're also going to talk about how to do it. And are there some patterns and some practices that leaders can come up with? The answer to that obviously is yes, or wouldn't be here. And then what happens when you do? And so we'll talk about that a little bit. Next slide. So let's talk about why a little bit. I think we all realize that we're living, next slide, in a world where things have gotten complicated. And there are a lot of moving parts. There are a lot of different stakeholders involved. There are a lot of different perspectives involved. And again, ecosystems are built this way. In an ecosystem, the more biodiversity you have, the more mutation you have, the more interaction you have, the more stability you have, and the more capability you have for further innovation, which biology calls mutation or selection. And we also have the capacity, to sort of stabilize ourselves against risks and threats. We're living in a time on this planet now where we're realizing how important ecosystems are. And as they get stressed, they're enormously capable of handling stress. If you stress them too much, they'll literally collapse. And I think we see this in, some of our human topics as well, where the tone of our times is drawn very hardly, if you will, around, or bigly, as our president might say, around boundaries and around conflicts and around identity. And so leaders are challenged perhaps more than ever by both the complexity of our environments and the tone of our times to think about how do we actually acknowledge these boundaries and obstacles and come up with a way not to ignore them, not to hide behind them, not even merely to cross them or deal with them, but perhaps to leverage them. And to do that requires, I think, a shift in some of our fundamental mindsets, some of our rules about how we interact, and then the ability to create new stories that allow folks who may be thinking in a stuck fashion to begin to think, behave, and interact differently. Next slide. It would be nice to think about this as, maybe we have 2 or 3 tough topics. I think we all know that we don't. I had the chance to be, I suppose, in several chaotic environments. Tracy mentioned that I was an emergency physician for many years and still am. And for whatever reason, my professional environments have always been ones of chaos, initially sort of medical chaos, right? But also team chaos when you overload an ER or overload a hospital on a weekend. But as I kept evolving through my own roles, eventually becoming CEO of a health system, it occurred to me that this idea of creating connections intentionally and methodically, but often in very tight timeframes or often across significant differences in perspective or capability, really is a ubiquitous capacity that we need. And as I looked at the various teams that I was on, initially small teams, 8 or 10, later bigger ones, 30, 40, 50, and later bigger and bigger ones, several thousand, what I realized is that if you look at any population, there are already numerous people, numerous relationships, and numerous approaches that are really effectively dealing with boundaries and obstacles on a daily basis. So it's been sort of an interest of mine the last decade and a half anyway, to look at what's really going on under that. Are those just accidents and sort of coin flips that we have that, if you put Susie in the room, it'll go well, and if you put Johnny in the room, it won't, which is how I thought at first, and actually how many of the healthcare leaders I interviewed thought as well. I used to ask people in the early 2000s, and I think I asked about 3,500 people, and could now kick myself for not writing this up. If you're in a really difficult circumstance, that is one of these snarly situations where new things have to happen, you're not sure how to do it, and you have to depend on people from different perspectives. And even though it's difficult, it comes out well. Who's on your list? And they always had a list of, oh boy, if I could work with this person or that person, absolutely, I would take that. And I asked them the flip side question: do you have people you wouldn't want to work with who would just make it worse? Well, yeah, I have that list as well. So initially, I thought this was a matter of who. The more that I've started watching, and the more that we look at the literature on collaboration, we realize that really anyone can, span a boundary and can deal with an obstacle. It's less about who and more about how. Next slide, please. So part of this has to do, I think, in our embedded idea of organizations. And I just noticed this morning when I was reviewing the slides. If you look at the one of the slides earlier on learning objectives, in the human head are a picture of gears. And that's, obviously a decent enough metaphor that this is making our gears turn. But it is interesting, if you listen to our language, it's distinctly mechanical. And I think we're entering an era where we realize that our mechanical thinking patterns and the way we design organizations and their work are limited by this mechanical metaphor. The org chart, in a way, to me, is necessary, right? It's helpful, it's real, helps define role clarity, but it's really a static diagram. It's more of a mechanical way of looking at an organization. And I think that we're starting to see that mechanical things cannot manage boundaries or obstacles. They're not built to be that fluid. And if you listen to our language about what we want from society at large, businesses, and particularly healthcare, we want agility, we want adaptation, we want sustainability, we want innovation. These are properties of biological organisms and biological systems, ecosystems. They're not properties of things that are static, like assembly lines or things like that. So I think one of the first things we have to do is acknowledge that the way we look at organizations themselves may be less biological than they really are. Next slide. If you look at what really happens in an organization, it really looks more like this, and so do biological structures. So our brain, for example, has 100 billion neurons in it. And if we tried to put together a 100 billion person organization, I think most of us would struggle. In fact, our brain, one single brain in each of our heads, puts to shame the scale of human endeavor in terms of numbers, where we have 7 billion people heading toward 9, 10, 12 billion over the next generation or two. And if you look at what's going on in the brain, it doesn't necessarily confine to the rules of the org chart, and yet its function, its ability to span boundaries, integrate very different pathways, fight, flight, or freeze, for example, with slow down, breathe, create, think of things more creatively or in a different way. Those pathways appear to be in opposition, and they're really not. They're in complementarity. They work well together, and they can shift to either or status very quickly. What's also amazing about biological structures is that they're defined by what I like to call interaction density. The number of collisions in them is unbelievable. By the way, if it just got noisy, there's a huge wind gust where I am in Colorado that I think just hit about 70 miles per hour that kind of shook the table. So that wasn't an earthquake, it was just the wind in Colorado. At any rate, we live in organizations where if you were to map people bumping into each other, they're bumping into each other at a rate that far exceeds what's depicted on the org chart. And I think this has to do with something leaders can and need to understand in terms of how will we construct boundaries and obstacles that otherwise wouldn't be there, as well as how we learn to leverage them and cross them. Next slide. So we have names for this new world, right? One word is VUCA, this idea of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, high velocity, high volatility you'll hear about. You'll also hear the terms Industry 4.0, which is this idea that coming out of manufacturing, we're not really in the assembly line era anymore. We're in the era now of cloud computing, artificial intelligence, and teams that are literally human and technological, which is a new sort of ecosystem that we're not even quite familiar with in terms of design thinking or maybe intentionality as leaders. We're just starting to understand it, but it's already on us, right? So if you have an iPhone or a Samsung, you work with a machine interface that clearly affects your human experience. in very positive ways, and science is showing us in very negative ways. And it really is designed as an ecosystem. Think of all those apps. They're very independent, and they interact with other apps, and they interact with other people. People interact with them in larger and smaller numbers. And so as we head into this customer-centric evolution of our thinking, we realize that there are variables out there that are new and that we're really not yet facile with. So next slide, please. As we think about this, and the average person sort of going to work, whether you're building, better OR flow, or trying to, drive population health, or you're partnering with pharmaceutical companies or community organizations to explore this idea, not just of healthcare as we know it, but health appreciation, much like wealth appreciation as we're trying to define it. Distinction and differentiation are really key here, right? A penguin and an elephant seal are very different animals. And we want things to be different in order to function, right? A nurse is different than a doctor, an OR is different than an ER, a payer is different than a clinic. And yet, at the same time, you can hit the toggle there, Tara, in order for us to take advantage of that distinction and differentiation, which we might think of in an ecosystem as biodiversity. And remember, the data shows that the more biodiversity you have, the healthier your system is. And there's a little bit of a problem too, because the more biodiversity you get in a system, the more biodiversity that system will create. And so in a system of org charts where we're thinking about keeping things uniform, limiting variation, being consistent, being predictable, the more distinction and differentiation you have, the more chaos you can create. And as people think about chaos and all those clouds or particles bumping together in that green and blue cloud diagram I showed, things can get pretty panicky, if you will, and it's very easy maybe to go back to sort of keeping things very rote. So at the same time that you're creating all of this biodiversity of thought and distinction and differentiation, you'll want collaboration exchange to do two things. One dimension is to create new ideas and combinations, and the other is to make sure that that collaboration and exchange actually drives a consistent, simple identity so people just don't get chaotically confused. Next slide. So I took this picture last week in the Charlotte airport, I think, and it reminded me of this talk. And the fine print is that if we look in this era of technology, we tend to think about it publicly as very, very optimistic and almost problem solving in itself. And it's like any other form of biodiversity and exchange across a boundary, in this case, the boundary being human technology. There's wonderful potential here, and there's also wonderful risk. By the way, in talking about this today, I don't want to come across sounding like a technophobe at all. I think we're entering a wonderful new era where this ecosystem thinking will allow us opportunities to integrate technological ecosystems and human ecosystems, teams, organizations, et cetera, in a way that brings a lot of new value. The fine print to me is that we can't assume these technology platforms will do this on their own. They'll certainly introduce diversity and hyperconnectivity at a technological level, but they won't necessarily help us cross boundaries and obstacles of thought and interaction in our human domain that we badly need to cross. I think the EHR and healthcare is a great example of this, where it brings potentially really great value, but the boundary crossing between clinical perspective and clinical workflow and billing need and data capture really wasn't negotiated very well, either in the design side from the vendors or often in the implementation. And it's created a lot of unintended and unanticipated secondary risk and secondary damage that we're now having to deal with. So one reason why to think about boundary spanning and managing obstacles well is not just to avoid getting knocked in the head or to survive, but to actually be really intentional about the way that we encounter these things, driving better value on one hand and sort of lack of isolation, and also avoiding the chaos of just pell-mell putting things in our environments that turn out to create a lot of extra activity and not necessarily a lot of value. And leaders have unbelievable influence in designing how a group of people approach these ideas with their mindset, and then how they interact to do it so that better things happen rather than more chaotic things. Because to be honest, left to random chance, either can happen. Next slide. So I like to use this example. I think we all recognize Morgan Freeman's wonderfully soothing voice from the Olympic commercials about Visa, everywhere you want to be. It's a great tagline for sure, but it's not just a tagline. It's not just a slogan. Visa is actually built on a biological ecosystem model of mindset, interaction, and diffusion. Next slide. Dee Hock was actually the founder of Visa, and this is sort of my guiding 2 sentences for life, I think. And I think we can see in healthcare, and I often ask executive teams and larger audiences up to 500 people at a time, where do you see these sentences at play in your organization? And it's interesting, usually I hear kind of a laugh and a groan, and I start hearing people talk about what I call sentence 2, which clearly is at play in healthcare. HIPAA regulations, for example, are really, really long, and they were written at the end of the Cold War by folks that used to control security and privacy around Cold War, rules of engagement and things like that. And they migrated them over to write stuff in healthcare, and they followed sort of a different rule set maybe than sentence number 1. Sentence number 1 is really a sentence of biological development. Sentence number 1 is how 2 half complements of DNA come together to make one cell, and then within the uterus of a human being eventually become a full human after 39 weeks. So initially when I ask people about what do you see in healthcare, they talk about rules and regulations that are so dense and so numerous that they can't even get their work done. But if you keep pushing them and say, well, when things work really well in your ecosystem, what do you see? They go to sentence 1, this idea that simplicity ought to be driving what really is going on. And again, if you look at biology for all of its elegance, we'll use the human brain again for an example, underneath those 100 billion neurons are not 100 billion ways to interact. The synapse rules, the way neurons communicate with each other, is very, very simple. It's elegant for sure, and it's not billions and billions of rules. It's a few simple rules. Next slide. So it's worth asking ourselves, in terms of why, with all this complexity we have to deal with, probably the biggest driver of why leaders should think about this is A, to get things done, and B, to realize that under getting things done, we probably need an approach to simplicity that allows things to move easily across boundaries and to address obstacles with this sort of sense of metabolic efficiency, if you will, because with all the obstacles and boundaries we have out there, if we don't learn to do that well, we get enough energy to maybe conquer 1 or 2 of them, but there are exponential numbers of boundaries and obstacles coming. So this idea of efficiency and simplicity of design comes into this equation. I think for leaders, we certainly want to embody these skills, but we're also really after creating an entire environment where these skills are at play when we're not looking, when we're not there. So can we get simple, actionable, and accessible really becomes the key question, which really moves us, I think, to how. And do we have a method? Next slide. Oh, polling questions, the thing that keeps you from dazing off during the webinar. These are a little bit like commercial announcements, but they're interactive, so I will pause. I'll try to make sure nothing blew over, and Lisa Clark's going to guide us through the first polling question.
Okay, great. Thank you, Larry. All right, so I'm launching the first polling question, which describes executive activity in your organization in terms of spanning and leveraging boundaries or obstacles? Executives embody or teach visible, accessible methodology in their roles. Executives actively follow methodology, but teaching is not emphasized. Executives are variable in their skill and demonstration of this capacity. Or lastly, executives could use some help. So I will wait a few moments while everybody registers their opinion on this particular question. Okay. All right, great. So I'm closing the poll, and I will share the responses. It seems like the large majority believe that executives are variable in their skill and demonstration of this capacity at 46%. 38% believe that executives could use some help, and 8% respectively believe that either executives embody, teach, visible, accessible methodology in their roles, or actively follow methodology, but teaching is not emphasized. So, thoughts on that, Larry?
No, so I think certainly good to hear those thoughts. I think we'd all like to see that at the top level of organizations, people are exquisitely skilled, not just at doing this themselves, but at teaching it, and beyond teaching it, facilitating diffusion of it across systems. So what I like about this, though, I think it shows the recognition that we have work to do in terms of learning how to do this. And I don't want to knock executives, especially being one myself, but I'm not sure these are skills we're yet teaching enough even early, right? I'm not sure how well we teach these in biz school, medical school, secondary school. I have 4 sons, and it's always interesting to me to ask underneath their topics, what are they being taught? And I still think that this probably shows us the opportunity we have to create pretty significant value, more accessibly maybe than we might think, by focus on these things. So appreciate everyone responding. There are more poll questions coming, so stay tuned. Next slide. So I'm sure you've got examples, a little difficult in the webinar, but in my CEO tenure, we had innumerable obstacles and boundaries to deal with. So one was a city issue. The health system that I led was held by a city, and the city was very, very divided, and had been for a generation, about what to do with its health system. Should it sell it? Should it keep it? And there was significant acrimony around this, and it was such an obstacle around the boundary that for a whole generation, people talked about needing to do something, and it didn't. And I think we see this everywhere in society these days, right? By the way, as I was preparing my remarks here today, I couldn't help but avoid the political underpinning to what we're talking about. We certainly see this in our political institutions right now, this need to be able to cross boundaries and obstacles, and more energy screaming and shouting that we're not, and yet less and less facilities. So I think your observations that skill is variable, and there's probably a lot to learn here. So a couple examples. One was the city. We had some orthopedists who were all very good. All you had to do was ask them, and yet they were in very competitive positions, and that was driving not just variation of cost, it was driving cost up so high that the organization that I led was losing a lot of money on every orthopedic case, and the orthopedic vendors themselves were, pricing themselves beyond value in our equation. And cardiologists had ideas about what they wanted to do with the service line, but because they couldn't agree, even though money was allocated for the cardiological service line, it was never getting spent. So in the organization that I entered in 2008 during the economic meltdown, that was 3 of literally an uncountable number of issues where there was a boundary, there were boundaries, there were obstacles, and we were stuck. So I'll use that as kind of an example, or a springboard for how. Next slide. And so this slide is obviously very schematic, but I think it shows that when we're trying to move the needle in healthcare, way up there at the level of competencies and results, so better quality, for example, lower cost, we're really trying to do 2 things. We're trying to increase consistency, predictability, stability, and we're also trying to create innovation, instability, right? More variation. And often you see people oriented around one of those or the other. You see the wild hares who want to innovate, break convention, disrupt. And then you see these tribes of people who are more along compliance, limiting variation, consistency, predictability. Well, the reality is, to get better, we need both. The things that are working, we need to drive harmful variability away from. And then in terms of improvement and radical changes in perspective, we need this more innovative mindset. And so you can go down through those boxes and see that there are obstacles and barriers to any of these levels. And of course, as we're trying to move the needle, these levels are very much integrated, right? So if you say to an innovator, let's drive out variation, do the same thing day after day, and check it to 6 standard deviations and say we're done, that innovator is going to get much less receptive to that conversation. And frankly, at a physiological level, they're going to get anxious. And they're going to argue with that, they're going to sort of hide from that, or they're going to leave. And you could flip it the other way. There's no better or worse here. You could say to the predictability and lack of variation oriented sort of person, hey, let's do it differently today. Let's figure out a new way. Let's junk the old way. And while they're getting more excited, the person who wants to go after predictability, they get more anxious and they get far less curious. So you have these uncountable combinations of tension as people are bumping into each other and trying to solve these problems. And I put on the right here an example that happened from our trauma team, which had been stuck for about 10 years. And they knew that getting patients off backboards early is a good idea. It protects them from skin breakdown and all sorts of never events like that. And even though they knew that, because people were from different areas and they had to cross a boundary, those obstacles and how they looked at the world and how they related were so significant that they talked about it for 10 years. And by putting in some of the approaches we'll talk about here, they actually got the backboard times down from about an hour and a half, which made me cringe, by the way, as an ER doc, and definitely as a potential patient or family member patient, down to 12 minutes. So they rebuilt the trauma protocol. They had to encounter this idea of their hierarchical culture. A couple of the senior people openly admitted that it was time for them to look their own narcissism in the eye. Imagine that coming from particular narcissistic places. It's really a turnaround. And then this idea at the more physiological level, we need to understand how to be vulnerable, that if we're going to actually solve these problems, there's a certain openness that we have to be comfortable with, and we don't necessarily teach that as a strength or as an asset in leaders or teams. We tend to see that as a weakness. So I'll quote one of the first 3 things ever said to me by a chief resident on the first half morning that I was ever a doctor, which was, never say you're sorry, it means you're weak. And the second rule she uttered was, never open your mouth unless you're absolutely certain that you're right. So these are not necessarily mindsets or interaction rules, those 2 that I just mentioned, that will allow a trauma team to rebuild a problem they've had stuck for 10 years, or cardiologists to get together about capital, or a city to figure out a very polarizing issue about what to do with a several $million-dollar asset that's worth billions of dollars over time. Next slide. So if you think about biology for a second, before we get to this idea of boundaries themselves and how to tactically take about this, you're going to hit a bunch of these, Tara, in a row. We're going to reflect on the fact that in evolution, you put things called organisms and species in a similar environment. So they're almost in a test tube, right? That test tube is an ocean, it's a pond, it's a prairie, it's a tree, whatever. And they begin to interact in a familiar pattern to them over time, and they do it again and again and again and again. And it's this combination of being in the same environment, interacting in a familiar pattern again and again and again, that allows them to polish both their stability and their ability to adapt. So one thing that becomes clear in an ecosystem like that is, even if you're in a different role, say the cheetah and the gazelle, this becomes a part of your identity. It's who you are. The gazelle is defined by the cheetah by the gazelle, etc. And this idea of tribe develops, right? This is who we are. But there's another thing that happens, which is that, next slide, things also become separate and separated. Even though the cheetah and the gazelle are in the same environment and identify themselves as, let's say, part of the identity of the African savanna, they're clearly very different. And we begin to see ourselves as different from and other. So this natural product of biology interacting over time is that both identity evolves, the sense that we are this or that, and that glues people together. And we know it glues them together not just conceptually, but neurobiologically. We'll talk about a chemical called oxytocin in a second. But we also understand that people define their we by the very they that's out there. And this is where things get tricky. Next slide. So the same thing happens in human organizations, right? These are some of my own mentors. This black horse is one of my favorite animals, and he is right now defining a boundary and managing an obstacle, right? The boundary is, this is who I am, and this is what you need to listen to. And the obstacle was, you guys weren't listening to me before and weren't letting me do what I wanted, so I had to manage it. And you look at it this way and say, is this really the way we want to manage obstacles? It works for horses because eventually they get, next slide, to this. So this happens to be a connection spanning a boundary between human and horse. If the obstacle was the horse's behavior before, and perhaps the human's inability to manage it, I can tell you that this picture was taken within 120 seconds of the previous slide. So I think sometimes when we look at boundaries and obstacles, we make the assumption that they'll be so difficult to cross, it's really going to take a lot of our mental energy. And I think one of our challenges in terms of technique is to figure out how to make this as easy as possible for as many people as much of the time as possible. Sometimes this is very difficult. There are horses that are really, really difficult to work with. There are humans that are difficult to work with, but we should be able to move into this boundary spanning mode pretty easily under ideal circumstances. Those ideal circumstances can pop up randomly. Wouldn't it be nice if we could actually create them? Next slide. So this is a slide I keep telling myself never to show because it's way too wordy. You might want to look at this one later. And it basically shows a mishmash of a whole bunch of neurophysiology that says if you design interaction between humans the quote right way, what you're going to find is that people are attracted to that interaction. They want to find it again and they trust it. And this is everything between, that we already recognize between a teacher and a student, people on a team, in a marriage and a family. When interaction is healthy, humans want to come back to it again, right? Of course, they also want to come back to ones that are familiar. But if they're healthy, look what happens there. The brain's ability to focus on things goes up. Its ability to analyze different variables goes up. Creativity goes up. Now, this is regardless of your preference type, as you might measure on a particular 360 tool. So whether you're an analytic person or a creative person, both capacities in your brain are enabled when you're in this state. Insight goes up. You're actually able to think about ways to behave and think in new ways. And so in essence, we know that the right kind of human-to-human interaction potentiates neuroplasticity, the ability for the brain to rewire and refire and develop new patterns. In other words, to see obstacles and boundaries in new ways. On the other hand, if you mal-design human-human interaction, you can see that that's physiologically taxing. Attention will go down, analysis goes down, creativity goes down, and insight goes down. You're going to push people into old behaviors. Anyone who's a parent knows this, right? If you have a child and you put that child under enough stress from sleep deprivation or overtasking or whatever, they regress, right? They throw tantrums and they are afraid or they're shy or they can't do this or that. And that's because these complementary systems in our brain are triggered one way or the other. And in this red loop, there are different neurotransmitters involved. Cortisol levels go up throughout the body, for example, and you're more likely to fight, flight, or freeze. You'll argue with things, you'll run away from them, or you'll just lock up and not be able to think. On the other hand, if you go into these other loops, the neurotransmitters at play and the pathways at play make your brain a lot more able in the moment to change, but they also potentiate your ability to hardwire those changes over time if you keep doing them. As the neuroscientists say, the neurons that fire together wire together. So practice counts, and the way you practice will drive greater ease to new patterns of collaboration, or it will hold them up. What's interesting about this chemical oxytocin, by the way, is it strongly defines trust within this idea of we. And it has another, we think from early research, deleterious effect. It reinforces your trust of we by also reinforcing your distrust of they. So you have to be careful with this. The more you create identity in a human system, the more you harden a boundary between one group of people and another, which means leaders have to think of constantly challenging people to cross boundaries and see different combinations of we, and they have to do that in a way that doesn't trigger these sort of red responses. It can't be something frightening or you're going to create immune response or backfire to what you're doing. Next slide. So polling question number 2, Lisa, you're on.
Okay, here we go. So this next poll asks you, which describes how you leverage the neuroscience of human behavior to support leaders in managing obstacles. So the choices are: you support and encourage curiosity, empathy, and gratitude. You expose a few people to these tools and techniques. A few people use them, but largely it's on their own. Or we don't really tap the advantages of neuroscience. So I will give people a little bit of time to register their opinion. Okay, a few seconds more. All right, I'm going to close the poll and share. Okay, it seems that the large majority, 45%, believe that they don't really tap the advantages of neuroscience. 36% support and encourage curiosity, empathy, and gratitude, with 9% respectively at exposing a few people to these tools and techniques, and also 9 people saying a few people use them, but largely it's on their own. Okay.
Well, again, really insightful. Great to see that over a third of people are actively using this, and then clearly more room for people to see how can we apply this practically. You can go to the next slide there. So I want to just get definitional. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. I think we made the point, boundaries and obstacles are potentially both barriers and gateways. And again, something that we already recognize in biological systems. They're both. Next slide. I like to think of boundaries really as something that help us define identity. They just separate one thing from another, and their presence actually enhances both sides if we look at it that way. And this is what allows, symbiotic role clarity. It allows two things in nature, in an ecosystem, to cooperate without losing their identity. So boundaries are necessary. Sometimes we hear this word boundaryless. If we were boundaryless, our eyeball would be no different than our mouth, and you couldn't, if you had a piece of food and were hungry, you wouldn't know where to put it. So I think it's just a point of clarity as we think about these boundaries. How can they be helpful to us in defining both differences and then ways that we might work across those? Next slide. Think about obstacles really as any property or object which prevents movement across a boundary. So a fence may be on a boundary between your property and your neighbor's, but the fence is the obstacle. The gate is the boundary crosser or the obstacle crosser. Cell membranes are the same way. Potassium doesn't just go across cell membranes. It's supposed to stay high inside the cell and low outside the cell. If that were not to happen, you would very quickly be dead. And so how does our body handle that? Well, it puts up a boundary. It puts up an obstacle at the boundary between cell and outside of cell called a cell membrane. And in plants, there's also a cell wall. And then there are channels, there are gates that allow things to flow through. So our job really as leaders is to find not how to tear down boundaries and obstacles, but how to find gates and channels across them when it's helpful. Next slide. So 3 principles. This is a little bit of a money slide. If you want to think from technique standpoint, how do leaders do this? From a system standpoint, thinking back to Visa, if you're everywhere you want to be and you want this to happen, what are some principles? One is to create what I call a mindset of the commons, this common ground where people can come together, not lose their identity, not permanently blow up their boundaries, not wish obstacles away, but here we can work together, right? The second principle is this idea of interaction. Inter is italicized because it must be something that happens mutually and reflexively between 2 different folks on either side of a boundary. So it's movement between. It's not one-sided action. If you had 2 people, there would be arrows going toward and from each one. And then, of course, the next thing to take advantage of boundary spanning or cross obstacles is that you've got to do this again and again and again. Think of, again, how the brain changes, how we develop habits. Doing this once is a novel experience that people compare to their norm. Doing it again and again and again has the advantage of making it the norm, boundary spanning and addressing obstacles. And it also has the advantage of having a lot of social momentum. I think we all recognize in the media, you'll have a politician who wants to do this or that, and he or she can't move because their constituency isn't there yet. We have the same issue as leaders, right? We can't have one team ready to move and the others not. So being able to multiply this effect across a large number of people's perceptions and participation becomes really key. Next slide. So this compelling commons idea is really around creating interdependence, not having people come together to stay separately. And that may seem sort of obvious, but if you watch it, when we bring people together to think about doing something together that involves both of them, if you listen carefully to the language, you'll hear a lot of legitimating, a lot of articulating of who they are and who their priorities are. And all of that's great, but that's almost boundary defining rather than common ground creating. So we want leaders to think in less of managing boundaries and defending them, and more how can our differences and the fact that we're in and from different and overlapping perspectives make us stronger. And you say, well, what's the secret sauce for that? It's not easy, and I think this is probably a really essential and prime leadership competency is to get people to begin thinking differently together without being defensive at the get-go. And of course, we have some problems culturally, I mean, big C culturally, the way all of us were raised, which is these sentences here, right? If you want it done right, and then we answer it all the same way, you do it yourself. This tendency really pushes us away from letting go of that idea of trying to do it right ourselves and just trusting that there may be other perspectives out there that may help. And of course, we have this idea, particularly in our business lexicon, compete, 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 compete. As a physician, as a healer, as someone who really ought to be the ultimate facilitative collaborator, I was raised academically to compete, 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 because it was the top of the pile that moved on, and the bottom of the pile, too bad for you, you fell off the turnip truck and you wouldn't be a good doctor. So we have these strong cultural signals in us that really challenge us and make it difficult for us to sort of shift into this different mode. Next slide. So probably a lot of you on the call have read this book. I think this is really one of the essential pieces of work to begin to create this mindset of, or this sort of commons idea, this mindset of the commons. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this here, except to say that the literature and research coming out of mindset and showing that rather than thinking of things as fixed, but here's an opportunity to learn, here's an opportunity to try repeatedly, here's an opportunity to sort of unwind or figure out a really difficult puzzle, is absolutely requisite if you're going to have people in any repeated or successful sense take on boundaries and obstacles. So read this book. It will make you a better parent. It will make you a better leader. It will make you a better consultant, a better teammate, whatever you are. And if you're in a hurry, even reading the first third is great, and read the new editions, because Carol's put out a couple editions since, and there's quite a bit of research coming out that shows even in healthcare, mindset training with patients helps them have better outcomes. So this stuff is eminently applicable and really helpful for teams. Another polling question, Lisa, this one I bet about mindset.
Yes. Speaking of mindset. Okay, which best describes how our organization applies growth mindset? We actively develop leaders and teams to leverage growth mindset. A few people actively and visibly apply and develop others. We use mindset language but don't actively teach, develop, or apply. Or we're unfamiliar with this language. This language is unfamiliar to our organization as a whole. Give a few moments. Okay. All right, I will share. And it appears that pretty evenly split. So 27% actively develop leaders and teams to leverage the growth mindset. 27% also have a few people who are actively and visibly apply this and develop others. 27% also believe this language is unfamiliar to their organization as a whole, with only 18% saying using mindset language but don't actively develop, teach, or apply.
Great. Very interesting. I would guess that 15 years ago, we would have seen very different numbers. So really encouraging. And again, I think room to make this an intentional, widely held capacity rather than something that just a few people do. Again, thanks for pulling in, everyone. Appreciate it. Next slide. So another idea on this sort of creating a context or a container, a test tube of the commons where people can begin to think together. Is from this book, Polarity Management. This is kind of becoming a classic. It's by Barry Johnson. There's a ton of literature out there about polarity management. It's this idea of understanding that it's easy to think about boundaries or obstacles as defining not just how we're different, but that it's either one way or the other. And again, often on the multiple choice test, we'll get to both and, but it turns out that the universe itself is built of both and, right? So we've got a fight, flight, or freeze neurological system, and then right next to it and interlaced and essential to it is this, I'm not going to fight or flight or freeze at all. I'm going to relax, I'm going to look around, I'm going to observe. So wherever you look in the universe, you'll find innumerable complementary pairs that are literally inseparable from each other. If you look at only one side or the other, you run into trouble. If you look at the downsides of both and avoid them, you harden obstacles and you harden boundaries. On the other hand, there is technique, which Barry describes really well, and probably some of you on the phone are certified in, and which I am as well, which is helping people get to both and realize that both and is itself part of a pair. There's both and there is either or. So there's black and white thinking, and there is gray, not sure what color it is. I would characterize healthcare as being really, really heavily loaded toward either or thinking. I know our language is changing quite a bit toward both and, but when you go watch people go to work and ask them to sort of come together over something that's vexing and got them separated, that very separation seems to push them into either or thinking. So having this sort of capacity in your toolkit as a leader and being able to create environments where people can not just vaguely embrace both and thinking, but actually have a technique for tapping the value of both perspectives and the downsides of both perspectives and coming up with a leverage map for those, really, really important. Next slide. So let's see how you guys do on this one, Lisa.
Sure. Okay, so this one is regarding the polarity principles, which best describes how your organization applies polarity principles. Again, do you actively develop leaders and teams to leverage polarity thinking? A few people actively and visibly apply and develop others using polarity thinking but don't actively teach, develop, or apply? Or this is unfamiliar language to the organization as a whole. So we'll wait a few moments. Okay. Just getting to the halfway mark. All right, I'm going to close the poll and share. Okay, so it seems that for 40% of the group, this is unfamiliar language to the organization as a whole. 30% have a few people actively and visibly applying and developing others. 20% use polarity thinking but don't actively teach, develop, or apply. And 10% actively develop leaders and teams to leverage polarity thinking. Okay.
Wonderful. So again, I think like mindset, we see a pretty healthy evolution, and then it looks like polarity thinking maybe not quite as widespread yet as mindset. Both of these sort of capacity of the commons elements are, again, learnable, teachable, and also in numbers, right? You don't have to do this one person at a time. So I think to me, they're part of a coherent method. We're going to go on to the next couple pieces in a second here, but even these are, as pieces, really helpful for helping with this obstacle and boundary issue. Next slide. So it's also, as you're thinking about containers or environments where people can cross obstacles, I find it really interesting to note how our environments are. Obviously, I do a lot of facilitating with small teams and large numbers of folks. And it's, as you get bigger and bigger rooms, it's almost easier to do this because the bigger rooms are less formed. These are a couple of boardrooms. The one on the left is in New York State. The one on the right is in Iowa. And look at the obsession we have with rectangles, which is, maybe sort of aesthetic and artistic and goes to how easy it is to construct 90-90 angles when we're building our homes and office buildings. But it's really, really worth noting that the way that we sit and the things we sit around almost lock us in to the boundaries that we have and create more obstacles. Put people across a table, they interact differently than if they're sitting next to each other in a small circle. And we'll see some more research on that in a second. So one piece of this sort of environment of the commons is, and this mindset of the commons, is create environments where people can begin to connect long before they get stuck on how different they are from each other. And then, of course, creating an encounter and experience for them to think about how they are really more alike than different is essential as well. Not idle small talk. Next slide. So in our world, what we had initially was we had all these different constituents who were very financially oriented, which I found really interesting itself. And the cry was really, when you got under all the issues, we want to spend your money our way. So staying within their boundary and wanting other people to cross whatever obstacles they had to get to them. And then we ended up with quite a few examples, more than I could list, of, there's a better way. Let's work together, which benefits us all. And again, that didn't happen overnight. It hadn't been happening spontaneously for many years. So exactly what happened. Next slide. So we sort of had a principle we would put in play. If you can get a place where people are sort of engaged around mindset, engaged around polarity principles, and you begin to think that way, then you've got to think about getting practical and tactical, right? Because it's one thing to say I agree with both end thinking, or I have a growth mindset, or I can conceivably see this, but you're going to run into real problems with real people in real time frames. So I think one of the things that we need to think about is, how do you actually design interaction, the way people bump into each other, the way they express who they are, the way they receive and see who someone else is, so that you actually can span a boundary and learn how to take on an obstacle. Next slide. And by the way, yeah, so let's go ahead, Lisa.
Sure. So this one is, which best describes how your organization focuses on designing interaction to facilitate managing boundaries and obstacles? Our organization actively designs interactions. Some have the skill, but it's not viewed as a strategic focus. We don't focus on designing interaction at the micro level, and our interaction is so effective, it's no longer a development focus. Okay, we'll give it a few more. Okay. All right, I'm going to close the poll. Seems 50-50. Some say that they have the skill, but it's not viewed as a strategic focus. And others say that they don't focus on designing interaction at the micro level.
And this one, if I'm smiling, I don't mean to be laughing at anyone. I find this absolutely fascinating. So in the world of systems, things are very, very tightly defined at the level of interaction and very loosely defined otherwise. So we'll just take a simple thing we all call table salt, sodium and chloride. The way that sodium and chloride interact is really tightly defined. What happens after that? Who knows? You might have, one little grain of salt. You might have some sitting around in a shaker. You might have a mountain of it. You might have a big cube of it. But fundamentally, the way that the sodium and the chloride interact is always specifically defined. If you didn't, you wouldn't get salt. You'd get something different every time. And what you guys are observing, and I would observe as well, is that when you go into an organization, this is left way too much to chance. So if you think of my 5 blue boxes before in the trauma thing, where they redesigned their backboard times so easily, and they did that, by the way, within 2 days after 10 years of being stuck. Really what we viewed in our organization as the pathway to crossing boundaries and obstacles and getting to better value fast was redesign interaction. Because what was happening is, even if people understand mindset, and they should and they need to, and it's a great thing to cultivate, even if they understand polarities, you'll have them sort of get that right conceptually or think that way in their own head, but when they bump into each other, all of a sudden they're stuck. So one of the things, the big ahas of my whole life, I suppose, is to think about how to design interaction. Next slide. And wonderfully, we have a lot of science on this now. This is a buddy of mine, Keith McCandless. If you're interested in this sort of stuff, go to a website called liberatingstructures.com, and he has a whole bunch of ways that people can interact that are fun, they're enjoyable, they break down boundaries, and amazing things happen. So my little holy grail that Tracy talked about of performance, of learning and vitality being integrally designed, rather than, well, let's perform over here and then we'll learn later, and after work maybe we'll try to recover, is all about interaction design. Next slide. So a couple books here, many of you probably read this. Certainly understanding what motivates people to actually continue to interact, right? So you're not going to always cross a boundary or an obstacle or leverage them or understand them in the first try. So repetition counts. You can force repetition by compliance and sort of coercion, and you can get away with that to a degree, but you're much better off going with driving intrinsic motivation. So think about my black horse, who's difficult for some people to deal with, and he's easy for others to deal with. Has everything to do with how some people are able to actually move his motivation versus try to make him do what they want. And he doesn't tolerate the second one very well at all. So my buddy Brandon, who I learned horse stuff from, who's absolutely amazing. He's phenomenal to watch. And he should be a webinar someday. He gets horses to do things that you don't think they can, and he has an expression called "never catch a horse" that I think is consistent with this. So as you think about interaction, you want to put people in a position where they are excited about taking on a challenge as opposed to overwhelmed by it. And mastery, by the way, is of the challenge, not mastery of or over other people. You want to put them in a position, what the author here, Daniel Pink, calls autonomy. I would call it volition. I don't think any of us are really autonomous, and you can't be autonomous as you negotiate boundaries and obstacles. You want to be connected, but people do it best when they are choosing, not when someone else chooses for them. And I hear a lot of leaders say, well, you know, people got to do what they got to do. There's just no argument about it. That may be true. That's different than putting people in a neural state where they are actively participating because they choose rather than doing it because someone else is pushing them. And of course, purpose, which in the original research by a guy named Desai was defined as connection, is essential to us as humans. Asking people to cross a boundary or an obstacle when there's no connection of meaning for them in that work is maybe workable once in a while, but they're going to wear out and they're not going to do it again and again. So great book, easy book. Pink, for those of you that don't know him as an author, not a researcher, but he cites a lot of great research in there. If you want to dig further, it's there. Understanding what motivates the human brain is essential. Next slide. So as we look at the neurobiological research on actually what does help people connect, I like to remember the mnemonic, stay in the cage. And I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly because I want to get to your questions. So you can just hit all the toggles here, Tara. So we know that these things, curiosity, affirmation, gratitude, and empathy, put the brain in that more neuroplastic loop. And I want to point out that it's not a question of manipulating the other, right? So if you have two people that are interacting, it's easy enough in our sort of more mechanistic mode to think, well, I have to get the other person curious, the other person in an affirming mode. So if I do this or that, I can kind of get them in the right spot. That's not wrong. But what it turns out is if you can have curiosity in the interaction, affirmation in the interaction, gratitude in the interaction, these things flow everywhere after a while, and they sort of affect everybody that's watching it and seeing it. We did a safety huddle in our organization that's still going today, 9 years later, and all the leaders that started or stopped. We did it every day, and we started off our safety briefing, which resulted in some pretty dramatic things, like a change in our serious safety event rate by a factor of 3 within 6 months, and overwhelmed what the consultants' predictions were by starting with a gratitude story. So this stuff can seem a little soft, but what you're really trying to do is create human interaction where this happens. Next slide. So there are techniques, obviously, for curiosity, affirmation, gratitude, and empathy, but you also actually want to design how people are bumping into each other. So this is an article from Alex Pentland that's been out 7 or 8 years now about how to design collective intelligence in teams. And there's some actual design rules here. For instance, everyone should talk about the same time while others are listening. And in this interaction, it's really poor for collective intelligence, right? It's a webinar, so we're a little constricted. I'm doing most of the talking, you're doing most of the listening. And that asymmetry keeps us from actually multiplying collective intelligence. So I'm not going to go through all of these except to say that as you think about creating curiosity, affirmation, gratitude, empathy as a way for people to think differently together across obstacles and boundaries, there's technique to those sort of micro efforts themselves. And then there are ways to actually organize the rules of how people interact in a room or on a team that themselves will give you gain. Next slide. This is a quote by Nancy Klein, who wrote Time to Think and More Time to Think, and I kind of like it. I had an executive in the last year who very highly placed, huge organization, multiple billions of dollars, and his insight at the end of the workshop was, you know, I realize if I spend more time now thinking about how I'm thinking, that I'll actually be able to help facilitate greater results faster. I've been always pushing to get to the result and haven't been thinking about my thinking. And this gets a little confusing. In not thinking about my thinking, I haven't been thinking in a way that drives the best results. So part of what we're trying to do here is slow things down. We work in a world where people have so much task on their plate and so many images coming at them from phones and computers that this idea of slowing your brain down and allowing it to access this more flexible, adaptive part is a really key part, a key aspect of designing solutions here. Next slide. So these are the rules that we sort of used for designing interaction where I was a CEO, and we made these part and parcel of orientation, our meetings, our coaching, our safety huddles, our how we coached, evaluated, developed people. And they were, as you can see, like Visa, pretty similar, get on common ground, right? Spent a lot of time on how to have conversations the way we needed to have them, when we needed to have them, this idea of designing collective wisdom. And then we built a mnemonic around a trusted colleague about what are the behaviors we need that actually allow people and encourage people to consider and embrace people who are different than they are, and learn to trust that the way they interact will get them to a common spot. Next spot. We also built a tool that made people slow down and think, as Nancy Klein said. So whenever people do something, if they don't stop and reflect, they lose the ability to get intentional about how to do it again or to observe what happened. So McKinsey has a great article out about why leadership development often fails. And I can't remember all 4 of the things they list offhand, but the one that's burned in my brain is that most leadership development efforts don't create enough time for reflection. So if you're going to cross boundaries and get people to cross obstacles, relentless effort will not get it done, right? That's more likely to give you a burned out doctor. What you do want to do in all of these interactions, and not every 3 months, but repetitively, and right in that micro interaction, is get people to stop and say, hey, what is going well here? What is it that we like? The brain's attracted to what it likes and wants to build more. How do we actually know what's going on here? That forces us to observe rather than infer. And what are we learning? This is the exchange of information across boundaries. You know, Tracy, until I heard from you as a person living on the East Coast what it's like, I was only looking at it as a guy who lives in the mountains. So this is an important part of the exchange. And then the commitment phase is this 4th question. Okay, given that we sort of have observed what we're doing and we've thought about what we've learned, what do we want to do next? And if you can get this going at every level, and at Memorial we used this in our board meetings, and we used it in nurse huddles, we used it everywhere we could. And not everyone does it at first, but the more people do it, the smarter the whole system gets. And you see intentional boundary crossing, but you also see people crossing boundaries that aren't even on anyone else's list. They just tell you, hey, we fixed this trauma protocol. We didn't even, no one told us to do it. It was just in our way, so we fixed it. Next slide. This is sort of what it looks like. You'll notice here round tables, people talking to each other across barriers. This was a physician leadership retreat, or a dyad retreat rather, in a big system. 300 people who started the day really without a lot of energy. So again, I'm thinking of this idea of better performance, wider and deeper learning, and more vitality. If those things aren't going together, that tells me something's not going right. And this was a workshop on specifically on change management for a bunch of people who really were pretty stupefied about change, felt the organization wasn't able to do it. And what was interesting to me along this idea of designing interaction is as soon as we got them talking and gave them specific rules for how to get to curiosity, affirmation, gratitude, the energy in the room multiplied by 100, especially over the energy that's in the room when I'm at the front with a mic going through PowerPoint slides. Next slide. So at our place, where we started with the orthopedists, all of whom are using vendors, the initial thought was to create a policy that told the orthopedist you only get to use one vendor, and we've decided, and that's that. And that would have violated several of the presets that we talked about, mindset, polarities, both their opinion and ours, and this idea of how we would interact with them, as well as human motivation. So we came up with this other approach that I mentioned, this trust cycle approach, and it doesn't really matter what your model is as long as you're designing interaction that works. And they actually suggested we use 2 vendors, not one, so that we could keep the vendors competing with each other. And with no other motivation other than patient value, we saved $3.5 million a year on preference items for orthopedic screws and implants and things like that. The cardiologist, and this shocked the person who was facilitating this, after arguing for years to the point that they couldn't spend the money, actually got to the point of unanimously agreeing in numerical priority 1 through 5, let's spend the money on this, 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 this. And then our city actually did come up with a unanimous recommendation on this really thorny topic to reconfigure its health system after these 30 years of avoiding the topic. Next slide. So principle 3 then, if you can get this idea of the commons, the mindset of the commons in place, and you begin redesigning interaction so that whether the people are working on an overt topic or not, or they're just almost invisibly learning to think across their boundaries and take on obstacles because of the way they interact, being attractive and giving them skills that without them really knowing it are literally shifting how their brains work. Once is not enough, right? So it sounds like a James Bond movie or something, but doing this once is a novelty. So what you want to do is design times and ways that people can repeat, and this becomes really, really easy. So I talked about that 4-question tool, but another thing that's really powerful, I think we all realize these days, is the power of story. And not just the power of someone else's story, but the power of leaders and teams publicly sharing what their conversion story is. And I think, conversion story may sound a little dramatic, but going from I used to think this way to now I think this way, I used to think this way about this issue or that person or that group of people, and now I understand this. Those are powerful shifts in language out in the public arena. And again, in healthcare, I think sometimes we do these things too confidentially and too individually. I think when you get people together to do this and do it publicly, you really gain speed and momentum. And you also gain this idea of renorming, that this is who we are now. These are not accidents. These are not anomalies. These are no longer mutations. This is who we are. I think the other thing that, back to my 5 blue boxes earlier, is tying the reflection certainly to the level of results, to the level of process, to the level of culture, but also to people's emotional experience. And this has been a little ironically gooey for us in healthcare, as emotional as our sort of native work is. And we've sort of stayed away from emotions, but I think we're beginning to realize now that humans make their decisions on emotional bases and on emotional neural tracks. The Nobel Prize literature says that as well. So I think designing experiences where people can talk about what it felt like to shift their thinking and shift the way they interacted is pretty powerful as well, and we've seen that happen. So I think the other thing to get people better at this, it's like anything else, little topics, little things, little occasions, often. Next polling question, Lisa, and I think this is our last one.
This is our last polling question. Which describes how your organization diffuses learning, curiosity, and thinking differently? Our execs are skilled at diffusing how people interact. OD and HR handles the task of diffusing these skills. A few shining stars self-directedly handle this function, or these skills are scarce in our ecosystem. We'll wait for some feedback. Okay. All right, I'm going to close the poll and share. Okay. It seems that 50% have a few shining stars self-directedly handling this function. 38% leave the handling of this task and diffusing these skills to OD and HR. And 13% feel that these skills are scarce in our ecosystem.
Wow, so this could be a webinar in itself. So bravo to the OD HR folks that are tackling this idea of diffusion, not just development of these skills, but diffusion of it. And then bravo to those shining stars. And I think this is one more reason why this ecosystem thinking is so powerful. As we talked at the top of the conversation, in any of these systems, you'll find the DNA that you need. You'll find people doing these things quite well. And so developing, teaching, exposing, storytelling is key. But really the key thing here is diffusing this into real work. So again, appreciate that this is an area of OD emphasis. I appreciate also that there are a lot of people that are doing this spontaneously, but really interesting that executives themselves are not yet focusing on this. I would think, again, that's a prime competency for executives, is not just to do, but to capacitate diffusion across entire environments. So it looks like some fruit for pretty interesting conversations going forward. by the way, one of the things TLD Group and I really enjoy doing together is this idea not just of competency, but capacity, diffusion of these competencies across many topics, many people. And it looks like you guys are agreeing that competency at the executive level, not quite there yet. So is this a challenge? Yeah, it looks like it is, right? 0% of executives, as you see it, are really skilled at diffusing these skills in an era where boundary crossing and obstacle testing are more important than ever. Next slide. So for us, this was a $100 million turnaround on a $700 million organization in 2 years. A 30-year problem was solved. And what was interesting, of course, is you don't just fix these things. Every time you cross a boundary or an obstacle, new ones are created. And that, of course, is how the world is, which goes to the need for diffusion, capacity, and sustainability in this regard. You can't expect a few shining stars to handle this and have an entire organization be as adaptive and agile as you want. This is an all-in phenomenon that everyone has to be comfortable and skilled with, and everyone is a learner and a teacher. Next slide. So some final tips. I think I've talked about these. Let's go on to the next slide. I think pitfalls here, I think you can go a lot faster at this than you think, but it's sort of along the lines of what John Wooden, the famous basketball coach, said. You want to be quick, but don't hurry. If people feel rushed, their brains slow down. I think if you design this well, you can get there a lot faster than we think. That's been my experience. And of course, that's what we like to do, is help people design. How do you diffuse these skills and multiply them in your ecosystem? Because the number of topics, the number of boundaries and obstacles is innumerable. If you push, people push back. And if you try to create intimidation across boundaries and obstacles, which again is politically apropos in our world these days, we see a lot of posturing across national borders and cultural borders and constituency borders all over the world. The more you sort of use threat, the more you create a threat response. And when you do that, you no longer can predict how people are going to behave. Some will fight, some will flee, some will freeze, but you're going to hit the wrong brain loops. Next slide. So those are the big ahas. I think this is learning and teachable. The key is, can you make it infectious? It's got to be intentional, and you need to have a method. And I think we're overdue for this, but we're at question time. Oh, the book.
Okay.
If you haven't read the book, and I've got the book, the book's great. It's wonderfully written. It's very simple. So, if you haven't read the book already, well worth reading. And it's an in-depth read, but it's not a tough one. It's not a 3-month head scratcher. This, I think you'll find really, really handy stuff. And Tracy, again, I want to thank you for putting it out there. I know quite a few people in the quotes there, and I know it's made a real big difference to them as well. Sorry, Tara, go ahead.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Larry. That was amazing. Now, can you see, what do you see on my screen right now? Because I'm looking at the questions that came in on the box. And, okay, let's see here. So, can one really break out of a hierarchical command and control mindset into concepts like mindset of commons, polarity management, etc.? Does it really require leadership change? I wish I could just drop it in magically. So kind of a comment. Yep.
Yeah, so wouldn't gene therapy be great? So just there was a lot in that question. So yeah, I think it is possible. And I think it's possible, if you think of an organization less like an org chart and a triangle and more like that beehive-shaped mass of collisions, you can start anywhere, anytime, and begin at diffusion. I think the key is that if you start it at the bottom and start getting it moving bottom up and side to side, that works only so long as leadership itself does not resist it. And sooner or later, at the top of a house, given that we are hierarchically structured, leaders have to either accept and embrace this and be willing to be public learners, or they have to be sponsors and developers of it. If they're not, you're going to set up an incipient civil war where people are, by definition, going against the coin of the realm, if you will. So I think the best way to do this is for executive leaders to understand this is a strategic capacity and let it loose everywhere and model that themselves. The next best way to do it is for executives to do this work themselves, which is why I love to work with executive teams, and then, quote, roll it out the way that they're used to. That shocks it shocks the execs a little bit less that way. It slows the organization down. I think the worst way to do this is to get a bunch of people at the side-to-side, bottom-up level excited and have them fear the top. And unfortunately, I think there are a lot of leaders, apropos of the way you guys responded, that aren't yet thinking this way well enough. If you can get them there, yeah, I believe you can actually shift this stuff pretty rapidly. One reason I showed the horse photos is I think the keys to this are creating an experience for executives that shows that leading this way actually is more beneficial for them than they realize, and that's something that they can hear, but they have to discover. So I actually do some horse workshops this way and put executives in with the horses, which is always really, really interesting. At first, they think it's about how you deal with the horse, and only after a few hours, to your point in the question, do they realize, wow, there's a whole different universe of thinking out there. So I think creating stretch experience for executives that's not merely about competency, but it's what if you could lead at a quantum level? What would that look like is important to getting to that level. And yeah, I'd like the gene therapy too, but I think that's the closest we're going to get that I can imagine at this point. Others may have more wisdom than I, for sure.
And then our last question that we have time for is, how do you know it's working?
Yeah, so I think you should ask that question. That's why those 4 were in there incessantly. And I would say the reason that you know it's working is 2 things. You begin seeing people act differently than they ever have out in the open and being unashamed of it. They're not trying to hide it. And you also start to hear about things happening across boundaries and borders spontaneously that normally wouldn't happen. In other words, they're not on someone's list. No one's pushing, and they start popping up like crocuses. So both of those forms of emergence, which is, in our organization, one surgeon actually interviewed in front of 250 org leaders, and he said, you know what, I was this way for many years, and I realized the folly of my ways. I was trying to go in that direction, but I was taking people backwards the way I acted, and I am now understanding I am thinking differently. That's a shocker of a statement to a bunch of people that had known someone who was an alpha surgeon for years. So you'll start to see things like that from unlikely places, and the higher the better, right? If the CEO can walk out and say, I am thinking differently, and I understand, and I am committed to this kind of thinking and loosening everything up, try me anytime, that's pretty powerful. And then I think when these things pop up and someone walks in your office and says, hey, we had this problem we were stuck on for 10 years and we just fixed it. And someone's like, well, whose operating plan was that on? It really wasn't. We just all kind of looked at each other and said, oh, let's just do this. That's when you know that they actually have a technique for it, and it's starting to ooze into all these different spots.
Great. Well, thank you, Larry. We are just at 1:30 Eastern Time at the end of our webinar, and we are just so thrilled that you could join us today and lead us in this conversation, and we are all the better and brighter for it. So thank you. Greatly appreciate it.
You bet. And I don't know if it's possible for people to get the slides. I don't know how that works, but my contact info is in them. So if you want to talk further to Tracy and Tara and me, by all means, and I can be reached at larry@epidemicleadership.com if you had comments, thoughts, fruit to throw at me electronically that you couldn't get over the webinar. So thank you, everyone, for logging on and thinking about this really important topic. I wish we all could have been in the same room, but it's a great start. And again, Tracy, thanks so much for writing the book. And onward we go into the era of ecosystems, not machines.
Thank you, Larry. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.